Hi everyone, I'm Nick and we're at Radiant Images and we're here to talk about the Novo and exposure. So right now I've got the camera recording and I'm actually, as you can probably see, I'm pointing back on the camera, pointing on me. The normal way to expose this camera is just pointing at your subject with the available light or the light that you've set and go ahead and lock the exposure. So I'm going to press the A button here. You can see the button board here. We've got record on the top, the A button, which is the aperture lock, the second button down. Then we have Wi-Fi, and then we have record. So I'm going to go ahead and point it at my scene here, and I'm going to hit the A button. And I'm going to put my hand over it, and I just make sure that it doesn't gain up or try to bloom up when I put my hand in there, and then I can tell that it's actually locked. That's the easiest kind of way, is just sort of artificially lock it and see if it changes, or you can point it around your scene if you want and see if it changes. But at this point, that's what you want to do. You want to kind of see if you like the exposure that you have set it at. And what I normally do is I put the lens itself, the actual stop on the lens, at a 2.8, because that's the aperture of the GoPro lens that's natively on this camera that's kind of been calibrated to it. So I like to start there. So I'm pointing at my scene. I've set my exposure. Right now it seems a little bit overexposed, a little bright, because there's really not that much light in this direction. So one thing I can do is I can just stop down a little bit. So I'm going to stop down actually about 2 stops. Maybe a stop and a half. I go back. Yeah, maybe a stop. And that looks a little more realistic to to what I've got. This looks a little blown out. So the next way to do this is to unlock it. Try this. So to see that I'm unlocked again, I put my hand over it. It starts to bloom, and you can see the change in the exposure. So another way to do this is to try to pick sort of a high and a low, so that you can actually have part of your the highlights in your scene in the frame and part of the darkest part in your frame as well, and try to find sort of a happy medium. Go ahead and go to 2.8 again and let it expose. You'll see in this shot I've got kind of this white card and a little bit of the white table in the shot, and then I've got the rest of it in the normal lighting where my subject is. I'm going to go ahead and lock this, and then you can see that I'll put my hand over it, doesn't bloom. So you can see the exposure on the whites is actually pretty good now. I'm not blown out as much. And I point it back to my subject, and that's actually pretty realistic too, as far as the lighting goes. Then you can fine tune it a little bit if you want to open up, maybe a half stop. I opened up 2.8 split there. And then I check my whites. They're a little more blown out now. So you can decide, whether highlights are more important to you. In this case, there's not a lot of highlights actually in my scene, but I feel like this is a slightly better exposure overall. Focus a little better. So that's another way to do it, is sort of fool the camera a bit by putting some of highlights and some darks in it. Find a midpoint that you like, and then lock it there and move it around your scene. That way you can sort of see your whole ratio of lighting and get a better exposure that way. Another way to do it is you could actually artificially put a light on your subject for a moment and let it expose to that, or you can dial it in to where you want the exposure to be, then pull that light out after you've locked it and see if you still like that exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock it again. So one of the things I want you to notice is when you're shooting into a dark scene, like I am here, that's actually really a dark scene. There's really not a lot of light there, but it looks like there's a lot of light because the camera's actually gained up, and it's introduced noise into the image, which is not a good thing usually. So to avoid that, you can go ahead and point it at something a little bit brighter. Again, trying to find this sort of midpoint, and that's why we do this. And then go ahead and lock it there, And you'll see it's a little darker, but it's less grainy. And then again, I can expose with the aperture. I can just go up a little bit, just give it a little more light into the sensor, and we've got a less noisy scene that way. So that's another way to do this. I'm going to go outside and shoot a little bit to show you how to expose outside. One of the other issues that we have sometimes is with motion, and natural sort of motion blur. So with this camera, you can't control the shutter, so you have to sort of fool it by playing with the auto exposure in order to do that. And sometimes it's when you're outside, the exposure wants to close down and be real skinny, so you get that sort of staccato, Saving Private Ryan type of jagged motion a little bit. So you want to counter that. You want to go out into the outdoors and let the camera expose, and then go ahead and slowly close down your aperture to something like an 8 or an 11, or all the way closed, but usually it ends up being around an 8 or an 11 on the lens. And your scene looks a little dark, but if you'll kind of wave your hand in front of the camera and see the motion in the camera and see if you like how that motion looks, then you can go ahead and lock your exposure there. And then you'll want to do is you want to open it up back to say a 2.8, and then you'll notice obviously that your scene is too bright and that everything's blown out. But you've frozen the exposure, the auto exposure, at the right shutter speed, more like a 180 shutter. So at that point you want to put some NDs in front of the lens. So you can put 2 or 3 stops of ND and still achieve, with your aperture open on the lens, you can achieve both things. So you can have smooth motion and you can have the right exposure. So it's a little bit tricky, but not too bad once you get used to it. It's a good cheat that you can do, and I'll shoot some stuff and show you kind of how that works outside. So right now I'm going to start off at a 2.8, which is kind of where I normally start. I'm going to let the camera expose properly. Can move it around the scene. It's kind of overcast today, and there's a little bit of sun peeking through. You can see it change a little bit, and I'll settle here on my subject. And then I'm going to go ahead and lock the exposure, and I'll put my hand over it, and that's locked now, we can see. So Michael, why don't you go ahead and wave your hand in front of the camera. You see how his hand looks kind of, staccato, the motion. Go a little faster, it's fine. Yeah, so that might not be desirable unless you're going for that look. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unlock the exposure. Let's so you can see it blooming there, and then it exposes again. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trick it. So I'm going to go ahead and close down to, well, let's say an 11. Go ahead and move your hand around in there now. Okay, that looks a little more natural to me. The shutter's opened up a little for us. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. So I'm going to go ahead and lock us there. Just look at the button. Lock it, and I'll check it. And no blooming, we're locked there. So it's a little bit dark. Not too bad, actually. It's, we've used, the shutter basically has opened up for us in order to, give us more light in there. So now, if I open up though, because I don't want to shoot at 11 on these lenses, I'm going to go to say a 4, which is probably a really good sweet spot to be in. But you see how the background's totally blown out. I'm going to go ahead and use a filter now and use that to compensate. Because I really want to be shooting around a 4, 5, 6, or even a 2.8. You can add a little more ND. So as long as you're compensating for, the ND with your exposure, opening your exposure and allowing the proper amount of light in, you're not going to get any grain or anything. I'm going to go ahead and expose. So that's kind of a proper exposure. That looks pretty close to what my eye is seeing. I'm going to move around the scene. It's a little dark over there. Then you could open up the iris maybe. Obviously that's not sun anymore, so this is the sunlight where I want to be, and I've got everything exposed pretty close to proper. Move your hand again Michael? Yeah. A little faster. So yeah, that looks pretty, you know, close to smooth 180 shutter. So that's pretty much it.